Hey team, I'm back. This is video 10, and it's one where you won't need to open our studio. Yay! Or maybe boo, I don't know. This is about the ethics of research. You will hear this lecture from me multiple times if you're a PSI major. You will get it in much more depth in qualitative methods. Here in quantitative methods, it's important for us to think about what the general principles of human subjects protection mean for us as quantitative researchers who are generally um, we might be asking people sensitive questions. We might be surveying populations with special characteristics of various sorts. In any case, this is just a really important piece of content to have under your belt. Um, the first thing I want to say is that we used to do research that was insanely unethical. And there are examples of people doing research that are insanely unethical still. But the kind of primary driver of what you see in front of you, which is the Belmont principles, I'll talk about why they're called that in a minute. The primary driver of that was something called the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. This started in the 1930s and went through all the way up through the 1970s in Tuskegee, Alabama. And basically, the US federal government and the CDC in particular decided just not to treat uh, the syphilis cases in a particular relatively poorly educated, high illiteracy, 100% African American community in the American South. And, there have been dozens or hundreds of deaths, many unnecessary syphilis infections. The kind of reverberations of that experiment continue. But I think the thing that should shock the conscience is that while the study began when there was no clear treatment for syphilis, the study continued well after the CDC knew that the way to treat syphilis is with penicillin, and well after penicillin was widely available. So essentially, the government chose to mislead people into having end stage syphilis. Um, I don't know if any of you have been to the Mutter Museum in central Philly, but it has a whole collection of skulls of people with end stage syphilis. They look a little like Swiss cheese. It's just an extraordinarily nasty thing to do. Um, and a huge number of public health officials went along with it for many, many years. And the story was finally broken by a journalist in 1970, I want to say four. And that caused an enormous public outcry, as it should. And the end result of that was that the government commissioned a panel of experts in medical ethics to talk about what exactly should be our guidelines in this country for how we treat the subjects of our research. Now, I want to notice that the Belmont principles, they met in Belmont, New York, hence the Belmont Commission. Their report came out in 1978 and is still widely cited today. And it became the basis for Chapter 45, Section 46 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which lays out exactly what researchers need to do in order to kind of show that they've been minimally ethical. So, if it is human subjects research, that is to say, if you are collecting data from live people, then it needs to go through what's called an institutional review board, typically at a college or university. So we have an IRB at Drexel. And within your application to an IRB, you have to sort of do due diligence on several points. But the Belmont Commission decided that there were three key principles about performing research on human subjects. The first is beneficence. So don't hurt people on purpose, jerks. And balance the risks of harm, right? So you can't harm people in any more than sort of a momentary way at all. Moreover, you also have to balance potential harms that you don't intend but that might happen, against the likely benefits of the research. Second principle, respect for persons. You will treat people as autonomous agents capable of making their own choices. You will give them enough information to make those choices adequately, but you will also understand that there are situations that can limit people's autonomous decision making capabilities. So, for example, prisoners are a so called special population. You can't do experiments on prisoners mostly, because guess what? People in prison literally can't get away. Similarly, children. Just as we say that children can't consent to sex, we say that children can't consent to have research done on them, except in extremely, extremely rare circumstances. So thank goodness we're not doing, educational psychology research, I guess. And what that means practically is that you need an informed consent procedure. An informed consent procedure is when you say to the person who you're interviewing or drawing blood from or taking a survey from, here's what this study is doing. Here are any risks that we understand to be, to come along with participating in this study. Do you wish to proceed? And you'll notice when you get our survey instrument for class that there will be a short, informed consent piece at the top of it. So everybody has to say, yes, I am willing to complete this survey. Finally, the third Belmont principle is justice. You should extend respect for individual persons to communities, is sort of the way I understand that one. So choose subject populations justly. Don't do the thing that the US government did in Guatemala for many years, which not only was to leave syphilis untreated, but to purposefully infect people, largely indigenous people, with syphilis. The United States government issued a formal apology to the government and people of Guatemala and various indigenous groups under the Obama administration. But that doesn't change that it was, a really, really rotten thing to do. And why did the US government choose Guatemalan indigenous people? Because they didn't have any power or they didn't have, sorry, let me rephrase that. They had plenty of power. They were autonomous individuals, absolutely. But did they have the ability to assess the research? No. Did they have the ability to publicize the harms that the research caused? No, or at least not widely. And in fact, this research project wasn't known. The communities affected didn't sort of have clear knowledge of that themselves until a historian found out about these procedures in a CDC archive. In any case, you don't get to exploit community vulnerabilities just because it makes it easier to do high-risk research. And what that means is that you have to justify your subject selection when you are applying to the Institutional Review Board. Now, some research is not human subjects research. There is a whole other ethical procedure for animal subject research. Research that takes the data of dead people and uses them, not human subjects research. Research that isn't intended to be generalized is not human subjects research. And also, research that does not run the risk of individual identification is in a separate category called sort of low risk or expedited approval. And that is what we are doing. We are collecting anonymous data. We are not asking about particularly sensitive topics. And therefore, had we gone through the IRB at Drexel, we didn't. Had we done that, our proposal would have received so-called expedited review, which is to say they wouldn't have looked at it very hard because the risks would be extremely, extremely low, and consequently the informed consent procedure extremely simple, and the subject population kind of obvious, right? So I think we would have received expedited approval, but we didn't go to the human subjects board, rather the institutional review board at Drexel, largely because it's an enormous hassle. We can talk about that in class. That is a decision I made purely on the basis of sort of my own sense of what the risks are to our subjects and my own sense of what expedited approval would look like. But it's not an entirely uncontroversial opinion, perhaps. In any case, what I'd like you to know is just what's up on the screen right now. So I want you to know the 3 Belmont principles that should guide research with human subjects. And I want you to know what each of them means and what each of them requires you to do. And that, my friends, is the end of video 10. Thanks for sticking with me.